tō tātou hui I pana ki ngā mahi tautea ki Taonga. Whakataka hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. Ihi aki ana te atakura he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ati hei Māori ora. Well, kia ora tātou. Welcome back for those of you who have been following this series of webinars over the last wee while. This is our last in this series, number 5. So welcome along again. This, of course, is about policy for government management of cultural heritage places. And today we're going to look at understanding the legislative framework for protecting heritage. So we've got a great lineup of presenters today to impart their knowledge about this kaupapa. Just before I start, just to mention that we are recording this webinar and it will be available on YouTube. So just in case you're not too sure about being recorded, I'll let you know. Secondly, yeah, for now, because we're in the Teams environment, and I think if you can all turn your mics off at this stage while we're presenting, that'd be great. And we do have as you can see here on our agenda, we're going to have a partai section at the end where you can ask questions there. Whether you want to do that on chat or to do that in person, and you can raise your hand and turn your mic on then to ask questions at that point. But yeah, first we've opened up, just got a quick overview of what we're looking at today, and then Emma's going to take us through archaeological authorities. Because Emma's actually just standing in for Vanessa Tanner, who can't be with us today. So thank you, Emma, for that in advance. And then she'll be taking us again for Rārangi Kōrero, the list, so she'll be talking to that one as well. And then Dean Raymond and Greg Mason will be talking about the RMA. So that's a good, decent section in the middle there. And then we've got Dave Gettings to talk to us about the Building Act. And then, of course, like I said, we'll get to our partai, and we can wrap up with some final thoughts and finish off our session just before 5. So, yeah, those are the main things we're looking at today. So if we'll just go to the next slide. And so, of course, all of this is pointing towards Policy 2, which is to meet legislative requirements and heritage conservation standards. So you'll notice on the slide just preceding the next presenter, there'll be just a little note of which policy it relates to in the document, so you can keep track of things there. Yeah, and just the next slide, thanks. So these are the main areas we're looking at. The legislation that we'll be covering. Of course, this is just a very introductory one, but obviously focused around heritage. So if there's any sort of follow-ups that maybe require a bit more detail or specific advice, of course, we're welcoming that through email or whatever else channels we put out there for you. So don't feel that all has to happen in this space today. So, of course, we're looking at the Resource Management Act, the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act 2014, the Building Act, and also just touching on now a little bit about the treaty settlements space as well. So, of course, the relationship in terms of the Crown and iwi, those who are settled and those that are settling, of course, there are many levels of relationship that sit there. They're very formalised things in terms of settlement acts. And out of that, often for a lot of government agencies and departments are also more specific arrangements as well that you'll be aware of within your own spaces. Often for Pouhere Taonga, it's looking at things like statutory acknowledgement areas. So that's always an important element of planning or decision making. So I'm really just sort of saying it's really important that, and there's probably people in your teams that look at these things anyway, but just to make yourself familiar with wherever a project or things that you're working on, that you are also discussing these early with iwi or settlement, post-settlement entities to look at how those things fit into what you're looking to do in terms of preservation of taonga within those regions. So, and of course, Te Arawhiti they have actually a portal there. I think it's called the Haiata. It's and you've probably got people who are actually signed into that, and that's where you get specific detail about the settlement and what other agency or Crown agents are actually sort of signed into that. So it's really important to get familiar with that, that whole space if you're not doing so already. So I think I'll probably just move on to our first presenter, which is Emma, who's our listing manager, and she's going to talk in this first section about archaeological authorities, who I know many of you may have actually heard Vanessa talking about it. So it's just a bit of a recap from Emma about that. Kia ora, Emma, over to you. We'll just make sure it's all...
Kia ora koutou, can everyone
Kia ora.
hear me?
Yes, loud and clear,
Great.
thank you.
Yes, so as Dean mentioned, I am the manager of heritage listing, but I do have a background in archaeology, so I've stepped in for Vanessa, who unfortunately is unwell, so just cover off this section. So in general, an archaeological site is defined in our Act as evidence of human activity that occurred before 1900. It can be a place, building or structure or work, and be able through archaeological method to provide evidence relating to the history of New Zealand. Archaeological sites have cultural values to Kaitiaki Māori, as these sites provide tangible evidence of Manatū Taonga. And many sites remain unrecorded and may be uncovered as a result of proposed works. So it's generally not appropriate to work under an accidental discovery protocol where there is a risk that archaeological evidence may be present. And generally, it's best to get an archaeological assessment or talk to an archaeologist. Often checking ArcSite and district plan maps will not give you a full picture of the archaeological record in that place. And an archaeological authority is required where there is reasonable cause to suspect that the proposed works would modify or destroy unrecorded archaeological sites. So the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga regulates the recovery of archaeological information and preservation by record where in situ preservation is not possible, and this is done through the archaeological process, which this slide covers off. An archaeological authority is basically a permit to modify or destroy archaeological sites, and it includes a set of conditions on the authority that are proportionate to the effect of the proposal on the values of the site. Conditions generally require archaeological monitoring, recording and reporting, so different types of archaeological method. And in some instances, archaeological investigation is required before works commence. All archaeological authorities require some form of archaeological reporting, and that's a really important step of the archaeological process, is getting that information and disseminating it back out. Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga regulates the recovery of archaeological information. And hang on, I think I'm reading through the same slide, aren't I? Sorry, next slide, Angelica. Yes, there we go. Yes, so I've already covered off this, sorry. Can I go to the next slide, please? So depending on the nature and significance of the information contained within your archaeological site, the conditions of your archaeological authority will require different types of method through which investigate. Basically, in order to comply with conditions, it's best to plan for your archaeological works ahead of time, so to make sure that there is a clear understanding of the timeframes and what's expected as part of your authority, and also ensure there is budget to cover off the archaeological investigation as well as analysis and reporting, because it's not just what takes place in the field but also what takes place after that's generally covered by an archaeological authority. And then it's also important to monitor and ensure compliance with the authority conditions. So one project that Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga is working on at the moment and is hoping to introduce this year is an online portal, which is a digital solution for both applying for an archaeological authority as well as assisting the authority holder to meet the conditions and be compliant through digital monitoring and reminders. And non-compliance with an archaeological authority can result in significant fines. So we're basically a method of trying to make that easier for the archaeological authority holder to get to those outcomes. Right, that's basically a quick run through the archaeological authority process. So next slide, and I'll move on to the listing process, which is my familiar area. So these are the policies that this relates to, policy 7, 8 and 9. Can we go to the next slide, please? So the New Zealand Heritage List, or Rārangi Kōrero, is a high-profile tool for identifying and recording Aotearoa New Zealand's historical and cultural place-based heritage. It is an information tool that informs both the public and the owners about these places, and those are the first two of the three purposes of the list that is set out in the legislation. It is also a source of information for the purpose of the RMA, and that council should have regard to the list when preparing their RMA plans. And Dean will talk more to this shortly. The information collected during the listing process helps Heritage New Zealand to advocate for protection and encourage appreciation of New Zealand's heritage places. Listing does not confer automatic protection, and the list is professionally researched and an evolving resource available to all New Zealanders. Next slide, please. So what's on the list? The list is made up of 4 categories of places. So you've got a historic place, which is split into 2 different categories, Category 1 and Category 2. So Category 1 is of special or outstanding historical or cultural value, and that's assessed against a set of criteria that are set out in our legislation. I'll talk more to that shortly. Then you have historic areas, which are a group of related historic places, such as a geographical area with a number of properties or sites, or a heritage precinct or historical and cultural area. Then we also have wāhi tupuna or tipuna, and these are places important to Māori for ancestral significance and associated cultural and traditional values, and wāhi tapu areas, places sacred to Māori in traditional, spiritual, religious, ritual or mythological sense, such as maunga, tapu, urupā, funerary sites, and ponawai. Next slide, please. So this is just a map showing the distribution of these types of sites across the country, as well as the percentages. So the majority of the sites listed are historic places category 2s. Next slide, please. So the statutory process is set out in our legislation under Part 4. It basically follows through 4 steps. The first step is to nominate the place. So anyone can nominate a place for inclusion on the list. Nominations should be completed in consultation with either the Regional Heritage Assessment Advisors for Historic Places or the Regional PO for Māori Heritage Places. The next step, once a nomination has been received, is to assess the place. So first assess whether it meets the criteria to be included, and then a subsequent assessment to determine what level of significance it holds and what criteria it meets. It also goes through a review process. So that's both a governance review, which is part of our board, and Māori Heritage Council has formed the Rārangi Kōrero Committee, and they determine aspects about the listing process. And then also there is a public submission process as part of the listing process as well. So that's when we send our proposals out to the public to get feedback, basically. And then once they've gone through that, they are confirmed, and that confirmation comes through our board or Māori Heritage Council. Sorry, next slide. So there's 2 sets of criteria in our legislation that we use to determine the significance of a place. So the first set is used for historic place and historic area, and then the second set is used to determine whether or not it's category 1 or category 2. This is only for historic places. The third set really is for wāhi tupuna, and then the section 6 definition helps us with wāhi tapu and wāhi tapu areas. Next slide, please. So the assessing of significance, this is the first set of criteria for historic place or historic area. So it's aesthetic, archaeological, architectural, cultural, historical, scientific, social, spiritual, technological, or traditional, and that determines whether or not it should be on the list. And then for wāhi tupuna and tipuna, there's the criteria there. For category 1 or 2, we then look at whether or not these historic places have values here that are of outstanding significance, and that will determine whether or not it's category 1 or 2. Next slide, please. So another listing program that we have is the National Historic Landmarks. So the National Historic Landmarks is a statutory initiative that acknowledges those historic places that New Zealand demonstrably care about as cornerstones of national identity. The aim is to promote appreciation and conservation of places of greatest heritage value to New Zealand. Eligibility is outstanding national heritage value, legal protection risk management plan, strong evidence of broad national and community support for its inclusion, and consent from all owners and registered interest parties. We're currently working on landmarks proposals across the country, and we currently only have one, but we're hoping to progress more in the near future. Next slide, please. So how can you find out about what is included on the list? We have the list online, which is very easily searchable, and you can export the entire list from that as well if you would like to look at it as a bordered data picture. Yeah, so it's just basically you go in and search places. You can search by local authority, type, region, names, numbers, various things. And another method to do that, sorry, next slide, Angelica, is to look through the annual information, which is a set of documents that we release annually that basically sets out an updated version of the list. So this is in all of our offices in a digital form, so people can come in and review it when they would like to, but we also send it out to government agencies, local councils, and various other people that subscribe to it annually. Great. So next slide, I think that's me for listing. Dean Raymond.
Yeah, kia ora. Thank you, Emma. And I think importantly, just thinking about listing and recognition in general is about how that then relates to the district plan. Well, of course, we have scheduling. So those distinctions are important, and I know we'll get Dean and Greg to be able to talk about that. Those and other things to do with the Resource Management Act. So I'll hand it over to you, Dean Raymond. Kia ora, Dean.
Kia ora, Dean Whiting. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Dean Raymond tōku ingoa, he kai whakahaere a takiwa o te pūtahi a Maui. So I'm one of the area managers in our central region of Pouhere Taonga, and I've also got a background in planning, resource management, consents, etc. So next slide. So looking at the Resource Management Act, Part 6 of the Act has, as one of the matters of national importance, is the protection of historic heritage from inappropriate subdivision, use and development. So it's one of the important things within the RMA. It's also significant that historic heritage has its own definition in the RMA, which I won't read out now, but it's there if you want to see it in the legislation. And as Emma has referred to, in preparing plans, whether it's a district plan, regional plan, coastal plans, anything under the RMA, the councils have to have regard to relevant entries on the New Zealand Heritage List, Rārangi Kōrero. So yeah, next slide. So looking at district plans, and similar things could apply if you're looking at a regional council plan. So district plans and other RMA plans, that's the most common way that historic heritage is managed and protected in New Zealand, via places being included in a historic heritage schedule and having the appropriate rules to manage the place. As I mentioned, councils must have regard to the heritage list when they prepare their plans. And most district plans include a schedule of heritage places, which usually includes most, or if not all, of the places that are on the New Zealand Heritage List. They usually have extra places that meet criteria for local significance. Some plans also include archaeological sites, sometimes just as an advisory layer and sometimes as the most significant sites that have been identified and assessed. Sites and areas of significance to Māori are also included in RMA plans and district plans. Under the definition in the RMA, they are part of the historic and cultural values, but under the national planning standards, they have their own chapter. It's important to note that sites and areas of significance can only be identified by the relevant mana whenua groups. They're the ones that identify what is significant to them as a site or area. And just noting that there is a difference, as I think even Dean in your introduction referred to, difference between listing by Heritage New Zealand and being scheduled by a local authority. And I'll also talk more on that shortly. Next one, please. Now, heritage orders. Heritage orders are another heritage tool within the RMA. They're much less used than just protection under district plans. Heritage orders are made by a heritage protection authority. An HPA includes Heritage New Zealand. It can be a local authority, a minister, or a different agency can apply to be an HPA. Heritage orders have immediate effect, but the downside is there's financial obligations on the Heritage Protection Authority, which might mean they need to buy the property. The effect of an heritage order is the Heritage Protection Authority has the role of providing approval for any changes to the place. The picture we've got there is right next to our office, and it's a Plymouth house, which had a heritage order put on it in 1982. Across the nation, there are 16 heritage orders where Heritage New Zealand is the HPA. All of those are dating from the 1980s. So it's just a sign that they're not as commonly used as other methods, but we need to include them in our mentioning. So next slide, please. Just giving you some examples of district plan provisions, and the table there's from the recently notified and approved Wellington district plan and some of their rules related to heritage. So it's quite typical that you've got plan provisions that include identifying lists of heritage places, which would include mapping of the places and including them in a schedule. Normally maintenance and repair would be a permitted activity in the district plan. Alterations, adaptation and additions would be controlled by certain rules backed up by certain policies. There'd be other rules and other policies for relocation and for demolition. And the other matters which usually touch on heritage include signs, subdivision and earthworks. Of course, there's actually a big variation between each council's district plan. With the national planning standards, they're becoming more and more similar, but it's still up to each council to decide which policies, which rules, how they word these things. So if you're working across a number of councils, you'll find there's a big lack of consistency between what's in a plan, especially if you're comparing a recent plan to something that's much older. So next slide. The next slide is just an example of how heritage can be mapped in a district plan. And I've taken this from the Porirua proposed district plan. And you can see the red outline in the middle of the picture is a site or area of significance to Māori. It's numbered SASM 20, and it is Manatū Taonga in Pauatahanui. And if you see in the middle of that, there's a building with a purple shape. The purple shape is a historic heritage place, which is actually St Albans Church. So it's one example of how you can see overlapping layers of heritage that are captured and shown in this particular district plan. Next one. Just touching again on listing and scheduling. So as we know, when we refer to listed, we're talking about an entry on the New Zealand Heritage List Rarangi Kōrero. Scheduled means a place being included in a schedule of a district plan or other RMA plan. And there's a big overlap, but it's not the same. We have places that are included in the New Zealand Heritage List, and the building there is the Taranaki Education Board building, which was on the New Zealand Heritage List, It's not on there anymore because it never was put on the New Plymouth District Council heritage schedule, and it was demolished without the need for resource consent. So that's a really significant difference between listing as a place, recognising the place, but the building having no protection because it wasn't in the district plan schedule. Next slide. This place is the Karkik Observatory near Featherston. Now this place was recently added to the New Zealand Heritage List. And because it was a recent addition to the list, it's not in the operative Wairarapa district plan. However, the Wairarapa councils have put out a new district plan and they have included it in their heritage schedule. So that's a change which is happening in that planning process. So the place will be protected by the planning rules of the district plan. Next one. What I'm going to touch on is heritage covenants. So heritage covenants are a protection mechanism that are provided under the HNZPTA, the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act. They're a voluntary mechanism for long-term protection of a historic place, and it's a legal agreement which is registered on the title. Covenants typically control demolition of a building, and if there's any alteration or changes to the building, then it would need to go through an approval process with Heritage New Zealand as a party to that covenant. Covenants can also be used for protection of archaeological sites. Covenants often come about through the sale of land, which an owner wants to see protected into the future. And they might enter that voluntarily. Sometimes they come through the condition of a subdivision resource consent, or as a condition of a funding arrangement with Heritage New Zealand, and sometimes through the Crown land disposal process. So a covenant is much more common than a heritage order. For example, in our central region of Heritage New Zealand, we have 93 covenants and we have 7 heritage orders. But scheduling of historic heritage in district plans is much more common than either covenants or heritage orders. That's it for me, kia ora, and I think next will be Greg.
Yeah, kia ora, Dean, and tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Greg Mason. I am a Principal Advisor at Manatū Taonga, Ministry for Culture and Heritage, within the Heritage Policy team. And I have the pleasure of presenting about resource consents, which are actually quite an important part of the heritage management system under the RMA. And they do have a direct effect on the heritage values of places that are scheduled in district and regional plans. So if you're not familiar with the resource consent, and I imagine most of you are, but Hamilton City Council defines it as council's permission to carry out an activity which may have an impact on the environment. So I think it's quite a useful way of looking at it. And in our case, obviously, we're interested in the historic environment, or the environment as it relates to historic heritage. And as Dean has mentioned, council plans identify, can we move to the next slide, please, Angelica? Council plans identify activities that are permitted and therefore don't require a resource consent, and an example is maintenance and repair of a heritage building. But where activities are not permitted, they will require a resource consent. And activities require consent because they typically involve some kind of physical change to either the scheduled heritage place or its surroundings. Now, the graph on the right shows that there are different rule categories in plans that range from permitted activities right through to prohibited activities. And these rule categories become more restrictive as the potential for damaging impacts on heritage values increases. So, for instance, you'll see this controlled activities as a step up from a permitted activity. And it does require a consent from a resource consent from councils, but councils are unable to decline it. So controlled activities are deemed to be relatively minor, and any effects can be managed through conditions. However, if we go to the other end of the spectrum, to prohibited activities, they basically, you cannot apply for a consent because their impacts are deemed unacceptable. The level of detail to provide in a resource consent application will be influenced by these rule categories. So the stricter the rule, the higher the bar is set, and the more information will need to be provided to a council to enable it to decide. And the scale and potential impacts of a proposal will also influence whether a council will require public notification of an application. And I'll just mention here that that's something that government agencies are able to volunteer. If it's a relatively large scale application or one where public input would be valued in the decision making, it's a good idea to actually volunteer public notification. Next slide, please. So when preparing an application, it's helpful to speak with the relevant council and Heritage New Zealand as early as possible, and certainly before locking in the detail of a proposal. And this will help identify the matters that need to be addressed in a consent application. And they tend to be called pre-application meetings. And it's typically a planner that will prepare a resource consent application, and they'll incorporate information from other cultural heritage specialists as required. And this may be in-house staff if your agency employs heritage specialists, or it may be external consultants. And that might include archaeologists, kaitiaki Māori, conservation architects. It depends on what heritage place is affected by a proposal. And it's important to understand why the heritage place has significance and what its particular values are. So site visits are really important to become familiar with a place, and information in inventories or management plans will also provide useful information. Once the heritage values are known, you can plan the work and identify the potential effects on the heritage place through what's known as a heritage impact assessment. And it really stressed to keep the development options open until the most suitable one becomes clear. And that's the one that strikes the best balance between the project goals and protecting heritage values. And where possible, and this can often be overlooked, look to enhance heritage values through the project and really highlight it in the consent application. It might include providing public access to a place, or providing on-site information about the place, or restoring original features or detailing if it's a heritage building, for instance. Next slide, please. So essentially, when it comes to a resource consent application, information is the key, and I approach it by aiming to give a council the information it needs to get to yes. And here are some questions that I think need to be covered. We've touched on some of them. So firstly, what are the heritage values of the place, including its surroundings? How does the proposal avoid or minimise impacts on those values? How is the proposal consistent with the plan objectives and policies, or the ICOMOS New Zealand Charter? And it's particularly important to show how a consent application is consistent with the relevant plan, as this is a matter that councils have to take into account when deciding whether to grant or decline an application. Fourthly, how have the views of Mana Whenua, Heritage New Zealand, and any affected persons been considered? And don't just state that you have engaged, explain what the outcomes of that engagement have been. What alternative options have been considered, and why is the one chosen the best? Is the proposal significant enough to warrant public notification? And in terms of presenting an application, visuals are really helpful. They can help illustrate the site and its surrounds, the heritage values of the place, any physical constraints that might limit development options, and so on. And using before and after images or drawings can also help with assessing what the effects of a proposal will be. And that includes both positive and negative effects. And councils can and often do request further information. So don't be surprised if they come back with a question or two once you've lodged the application. It is quite normal. Next slide, please, Angelica. So I just wanted to really briefly give you some stats about resource consents, because I'm not sure how well this is understood. So this has come from the Ministry for the Environment. It covers a 5-year period, 2014-15 to 2021-22. And these are all resource consents on across the country. And what their data shows is that nearly all resource consent applications over that 5-year period were granted. So 99.6% of consent applications. And nearly all of those applications were decided on a non-notified basis. So less than 4% were actually publicly notified. And council sought further information for between 1/3 and 1/2 of new applications. So as mentioned, it's relatively common that the application doesn't contain all the information the council needs. And the median processing time was around 9 weeks over that 5-year period, or 46 working days. So allow enough time for the process to play out, and bear in mind that 9 weeks doesn't include the time spent preparing the application. Next slide, please. So just finally, I wanted to touch on the fast track consenting process, which is something that's relatively new to the planning landscape, and it's begun to become, I think, quite an established part. It was introduced in the Natural and Built Environment Act, but of course that's now been repealed, although the fast track consenting provisions are still active, and there have been a number of consents under that legislation. But more importantly, the government is currently establishing a new fast track consenting process that will replace the NBA one. And as I'm sure you know, the fast track approvals bill has been introduced to Parliament and is currently at the select committee stage. The bill's purpose is, and this is a direct quote, to provide a fast track decision-making process that facilitates the delivery of infrastructure and development projects with significant regional or national benefits. And the process is intended to take a one-stop shop approach to consenting, and it incorporates resource consents under the RMA, archaeological authorities under the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga Act, as well as consenting requirements under other acts, and it packages it all up into a single consenting process. So there is still a way to go with that bill. There has been quite a lot of opposition to it, and to the thing as a whole, but also to core aspects of it. So I think we're likely to see some pretty core changes made, but it's definitely one to watch this space, because I think it will offer a process for government agencies who undertake large infrastructure projects, and obviously, it has the potential to also have impacts on cultural heritage. So thank you, that's it for me. I'm happy to take questions at the end, but back to you, Dean.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for that, Greg, and Dean Raymond as well. That was excellent coverage of the RMA. Now we're going to go over to you, Dave Giddings, to look at the Building Act. So kia ora, Dave, and welcome.
Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. My name's Dave Giddings, the manager of the Building Performance and Engineering team here at MB. And that team, or teams, they provide the guidance documents to the building code, plus the acceptable solutions verification methods. So if we just kick things off around the Building Act, the next slide, please. And I just wanted to give a bit of an overview of the Building Act, and I'm not saying that this is more or less complicated than any other piece of legislation that you will deal with, or any area of subject matter expertise that you will deal in, but it's just another layer that is needs to be dealt with. And if we look at the first Building Act, which was introduced in 1991, it was pretty a simple document of 93 sections. That changed post Leaky Homes and the 2004 Act, where we have the Act now. It's sitting at something like 680 odd sections, 25 regulations, 9 orders, I think it's 5 schedules. We have acceptable solutions and verifications to the 38 different code clauses for the building code compliance. That covers around 1,500 pages of documentation. Within those acceptable solutions verification methods, we have primary cited standards, and there's around 600 or so of those. Then if we start to move into secondary cited standards, which you're probably familiar with, those standards cited within standards, standards cited within standards, you're heading into the 3,000 mark. And like I said, it's not to say that it's more or less complicated, it's just a whole lot of more complication to add on to everyone's life. So I'm not going to get very much into the Building Act in the 8 minutes or 7 minutes, whatever it is, but I'm just going to pick out a few things that people stumble over with building code, Building Act, building consent. So if we could just kick things off with the next slide, which has the It has the purposes and principles in the Act, and heritage is only mentioned twice in the Building Act, 2004 Building Act, and this is one of them. The purpose section of Section 4 is quite short. Section 5 is a bit longer, and it's around ensuring that the principles are relevant to the performance of functions or duties imposed or the exercise of powers conferred. So it's about taking it into account, but it doesn't actually direct much further than taking into account. Part L of that section is the need to facilitate the preservation of buildings of significant cultural, historical or heritage value. What the Act, how the Act actually works in this regard is that it doesn't discriminate in any of the buildings, so it doesn't prevent anything. It doesn't particularly allow for heritage in any specific way, but it doesn't prevent any work being done. So if we look at the next slide, it picks up a couple of sections that tend to be some showstoppers for people around building consent. And it's around building work and what is a building and what is not a building. It seems quite clear on the face of it as to what is a building and what is not a building. But the tricky bit here is that you only need a consent for building work. This gets a lot of people into a bit of trouble. A building in of itself does not need a building consent. Only building work in connection with a building needs a building consent. And then it goes into a definition of what is a building, but just to try and make that a little bit more helpful is what is not a building. And you think that would be quite clear, but when we come down to things like tiny homes and wheels, what's a vehicle and what's a building, that starts to get a little bit murky. So around the building, so it's a really important thing to be thinking about in terms of a building consent. What is the building work? It is not what the building is, it is what is the building work. And some of the more obvious ones is when you're relocating a building, you're not actually building a building. The relocation of the building does not require a consent. You can pick up a building and move it. That's not the consent. It's the building work. So if you're doing your foundational work, piles, connections, site work, that's the building work, and that's the bit you need a building consent for, not the building itself. Whether you need a building consent or not, and there is ways of not having a building consent, you must comply with the building code. So there's a catch-all there under section 17 of the Act. It says you must comply with the building code. What's our next slide? Always exciting. Oh, okay, this is the other part of the Building Act out of its 680 sections that actually mentions heritage. And it's around project information memorandums and building consents. And it can get a little bit, for the most part, when I'm talking about a territorial authority and a building consent authority, you've got the same people wearing different hats, and it merges and it becomes almost irrelevant as to specifying the difference between a territorial authority and a building consent authority. However, it can get a little bit tricky, and it may get a little bit tricky in the future if things change. So if an application for a PIM and or building consent comes in, the territorial authority must advise Heritage New Zealand within 5 working days of receiving that application. Now, just of note is that there's no mechanism to stop the building consent. The building consent can still be granted, but there is as there is for everyone, you must comply with the building owner must comply with all acts. So this is where Heritage New Zealand would come in to say what is required if that building was on a historic place or historic area. When I say when I sort of pointed out there's a TA to a BCA, BCA to a TA, and most people are just wearing the same hats and do that. At the moment, we only have one accredited and registered building consent authority that is not within a council, and that is Consentium, that sits outside of a council. But there's no reason, and there may be in the future, who knows, that other building consent authorities don't necessarily need to sit inside a territorial authority. They may be quite separate. Then the notification part can actually get a little bit strained, and so passing of that information. So if there is any, I would say to anyone who is interested in this, if there was to be any consultation in the future which separated out BCAs and TAs, it's something that needs to be taken care of. How do you actually pass that information from one to the other to actually get a notification that someone is wanting to change a historic building? What's our next slide, please? So I talked about whether you need a building consent or not. There is section 40 which allows, or actually section 41, you do not actually need a building consent for all work. There are exemptions for building consents. And this is described in Schedule 1 of the Act, but there is some very helpful guidance that puts it into a much more of a plain English in terms of what work does not require a building consent. I won't go through all of that. I say that most buildings will be able to use these exemptions, other than if you're in a designated area, which is a defence area, sorry, or energy works, for some energy works, unless you're, of course, you're a specified system, so automatic doors or sprinkler systems, and it triggers a building consent requirement. And why I say this is because hopefully for the next slide, which is another section of the Act, I've only talked about I think 8 sections, but this one I could probably do 2 hours on section 112, alterations to existing buildings. So this is where there is a building that does require building consent to do the work. Then there's means of escape and access facilities for disabled persons need to be upgraded. Now, this actually causes a lot of angst and a lot of work for those who are applying for building consents, and also for building consent authorities who have to make a decision, although they should be reliant on section L of the principles, purposes of the Act. But this actually can be quite a tricky thing to navigate. The idea of section 112 of the Act is that over time all buildings slowly become upgraded, and they are upgraded in these very key areas of means of escape from fire or access facilities. But that can put in a lot of issues in terms of heritage buildings, and they come across and can clash quite a lot. I'm like I say, I could probably go into a couple of hours of this, of assessments of means of escape from fire and access facilities, and how a gap analysis could be done for this particular section of the Act, but I don't have that time, and I think I've already over, so I'll finish up right there.
Well, thank you so much for that, Dave. I appreciate it. It's very difficult to fit in the whole Building Act into 7 or 8 minutes, so much appreciated for those points on what to look out for, ngā mihi. Now we've got to the bit where you can ask some questions of our experts here who presented this afternoon. So I'll just sort of, I'm not really looking, I'm listening out for Angelica. She might have some questions in the chat area, or raise your hand.
No, we haven't received anything in the Q&A section. But yes, everyone, if you've got a question, you could type one in or unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah. So, so just while we're doing that, unless there's one that's rushed in already, yeah, just to recap briefly, and please jump in. I'm just sort of giving some space, but yeah, it was great to get that overview from Emma, and thanks again for also taking us through the Archaeological Authority process. Importance with a lot of these things, of course, is coming in early, getting that advice early, and any consultation, of course, that you might be doing with mana whenua as well. Any questions there yet, Angelica? You'll sing out anyway.
No, nothing yet.
None, yep. So in terms of the Rārangi Kōrero, the list, Emma then talked about the purpose, and we're making that distinction between those that are scheduled and those that are on the Rārangi Kōrero list. I mean, a way to look at it is that one is the national list of significance, and then of course you have that higher tier of National Historic Landmarks as well. And the other is more regional, because it's within the district plan framework there. but as Dean had pointed out also, that those is where the actual rules apply. That's where the management or protection actually exists within the rules. Again, with Dean and Greg, thank you again. It was really about that early engagement with councils in Heritage New Zealand, and also places to go to get that initial advice. It's almost that pre-application advice as well. And of course, the level of information you need is often is determined by the scale of the proposal. And it's always good to be mindful about, when working with agencies or councils, is that, depending on how large, and sometimes government things are large, that you do need to give consideration about time in which staff can actually absorb or be able to meet some of the many maybe complex questions that you're putting towards them.
Oh, we've got a question
We've
from
got a
Boris.
question, great.
Well, two questions from Boris. The first one is, can you search the Rarangi Korero list by neighborhood? Can I type in Mount Eden and get all the listed buildings? I've always struggled to get that. Emma probably is a question for you.
Kia ora, Boris. No, you can't. You could use the map feature to sort of drill down on a neighborhood, but you couldn't sort of type in the name of a neighborhood and find it that way, unfortunately.
Thank you. A second question from Boris. Has there ever been a discussion about consolidating the list and schedule, possibly matching them? It was difficult when people would call and get confused where they don't overlap.
I don't know if there has been in the past. I'm sure there's been many different discussions about different strategic ways to deal with the list. I guess it's the distinction between the two different things, with your list being sort of a national identity tool assessed against a different set of criteria, and then your schedule having more of a protective element, and also them being done by two different organisations. Yeah, I don't know if anyone else, maybe Dean Raymond, has any memory of that sort of action taking place.
No, the answer is no. I don't have any more knowledge from that, but they are different organisations. I think that's probably a key thing, that at the moment they're not controlled in the same way. The Natural Built Environment Act did have a provision for Category 1 places to be automatically protected in district plans, but that legislation has gone now. Yeah, I thought I'd respond to the last point that Dave made about disability access, that it can be a clash with heritage buildings, but it doesn't have to be. And I think I've seen lots and lots of examples where it's not a matter of if it can or can't happen, it's a matter of doing it in the best way to provide the best appropriate access for disability and fire escape in the best way to match with a heritage building. So I think these things can be done. Yeah, just thought I'd comment on that one.
Great. No, that's useful. Thank you. We've got a couple of more minutes. Is there any other questions there, Angelica?
Nothing at the moment.
Just give it a little moment. Possibly. We're probably about there. Remember, you can contact us about anything else, and that might be specific to what you're looking at, because with Pouhere Taonga and regional offices as well. So that draws to close our partai section. This next one is just to indicate you of what's next in terms of webinars and some interaction, but I'll get Peter Richardson to talk about that from our policy team. Kia ora, Peter.
Kia ora, Dean. Yes, so that finishes the webinar series that we've been running. Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga has been running on behalf of Manatū Taonga on the policy for government management of cultural heritage places. But we do have one extra webinar if people are interested. So we're really seeking your feedback on how we're doing at Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga, and we have a program coming up of reviewing our statements of general policy. So I'd be quite keen, if people are interested, to run through what that review is and to seek your feedback on how we're doing. So our statements cover virtually everything that you've heard about over the past webinars. So advocacy, archaeology, listing, landmarks and properties. And Angelica will be sending out an invite to a webinar, shorter than the ones we've been having recently, but a webinar nevertheless, just to set your feedback on how we're doing as an organisation on those topics, and help us build a better statement of general policy on how we operate. So kia ora. Thank you, Dean.
Kia ora. Thank you, Peter. So yeah, really encourage you to come on to those if you can. That would be most welcome. And just to really round off and just to thank everyone for coming along to be part of this little journey that we've had over 5 webinars. So thank you to all of you who have been part of it right through. Those who just joined us today, it's great to see you. Remembering that there are back recordings of these sessions on our YouTube channel, and I think those are made available. This will probably be out in a week or 2. Can't quite remember, Angelica, but so all of it is there. Great, there you go. And so pass it on to others you think who might benefit from it as well. So, you know, it has an enduring life beyond today. So thank you again. I'd just like to thank Manatū Taonga, who supported this series of webinars. So kanuta mihi kia koutou, tērā. And also for today. For Emma, Dean Raymond, Greg and Dave, thank you very much for giving your time and your expertise to this kaupapa. And just a special thanks to Peter Richardson and his team here at Pouhere Taonga, and in particular Angelica, who throughout has organised, corralled us, encouraged us, and made those connections with you out there. So a special thank you to Angelica for your mahi. So that's it. I'll draw it together with our final karakia. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te uru tapanui. Kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takatū. Koia rā e rongo whakairia ake ki runga kia tīna. Haumi e hui e taiki e. Kia ora tātou.